Hi, folks. I'm Tom Ferguson, and this panel is on the history and theory of especially on the interwar experience. Let me just explain what I'm hoping will happen here. We have two papers, both that deal with effectively what might be called the institutional aspects of income issues, or the social class issues of income distribution issues, and an attempt to actually look at some real historical experience. You know, it's one of the striking things in the Piketty book, which I think has many real merits, but one of them is not a close reading of the historical facts. I mean, it's sort of said that you look at the sort of aggregate record, and you can see that between World War I and then World War II, there's a giant break in the series. That continues down past, as Gerard will be pointing out, down to maybe 1973, and then things change. We all know things change now. You don't need much in the way, you don't need a weatherman to tell which way the wind is blowing, which is as close as I'm ever going to get to quoting music to you folks. So I thought it would be nice to have a panel where we could actually look at institutional facts and talk about income distribution. And so we have two papers, one on the interwar and one on the post-war period, if you'll accept that as your sort of a description. We'll talk of them. I'm actually going to comment a bit on each. These are very good. The first thing I say is I think both papers are extremely interesting and worth anybody's time, but I also would like to query them a bit, because I'm not actually real satisfied with much of anybody's income history discussions. Not these papers. What they do is obvious. You'll see immediately, they're obviously very well done. The question is, what do they mean for income distribution in theory in a broader sense? Each paper will get about 15 minutes. And I'll talk for a bit, though I may ask more questions, and then we will throw the discussion open to everybody. So there we are, and I guess it would make sense to do in temporal order that you're dealing with, right? First paper is on the value of political connections in fascist Italy, stock market returns and corporate networks. I don't know how you folks care to do this.
Yeah, she's presenting and then...
What's that? Tiziana turned on her microphone. Yours went off.
Okay.
Oh.
Then that's fine. I'll just sit.
Okay, thank you. So, in recent years, we have seen the publication of many works concerning with the search for empirical evidence of a positive relation between political connections, economic rent, and the value of firms. Our paper contributes to this line of research. Specifically, our research provides an analysis of the value of political connections between the Italian firms and the fascist regime during the years of Mussolini's rise to power, that is, in the years from 1921 to 1925. At the end of World War I, Italy went through a deep economic crisis. Broadly, Italy was heavily indebted at international level because of war expenses. There was high unemployment rate, and the social situation was characterized by repeated strikes in cities and country. Mussolini's rise to power took place in a context of social and political instability. First of all, I will offer you an overview of the main phases of Mussolini's rise to power. In spring 1921, Mussolini transformed the fascist movement into the National Fascist Party, hereafter PNF. And in the general elections that took place in May 1921, 33 candidates of the PNF became deputies. In this group there was Mussolini as well. With the general elections of May 1921 began a long period of political and social crisis. On the one hand, Mussolini was able to present the PNF to public opinion as a safeguard of the public order by means of the fascist action squads. And on the other hand, the leaders of the other Italian political parties weren't able to overcome their personal interest and to form a joint front against fascism. And after this election, the political situation was very stable. From July 1921 to October 1922, three different governments followed each other. The Bonomi government, the first Facta government, and the second Facta government. After the second Facta government followed the first Mussolini government. And as we know, the first Mussolini government began with an unexpected event, that is the Marcia su Roma, the March on Rome, that is the military expedition, the fascist military expedition to Rome. In the build-up this military expedition, three dates are crucial for us. On October the 16th, 1922, Mussolini met with some generals of the Italian army who were also members of the PNF in order to seek the support of parts of Italian army. On October the 24th, 1922, during a secret meeting in Naples, Mussolini fixed the date of the March on Rome. And in the morning of October the 28th, 1922, King Vittorio Emanuele III of Savoia refused to declare the state of siege and compelled Facta to resign. The Italian army was able to contrast the action fascist squads. So today it's quite hard to understand why the king refused to declare the state of siege. However, on October 29, 1922, the king gave Mussolini the task of forming a new government, and in November began the first Mussolini government. Mussolini's first government had the official confidence of both Confindustria, the Confederation of Italian Industry, and Assonime, the Association of Italian Joint Stock Companies. In an official declaration, Confindustria claimed to have exerted a direct and pressing influence in favor of Mussolini's solution. So, in this case, the Italian industry declared to have supported Mussolini's rise to power. Nevertheless, the extent of Italian magnates' support for Mussolini is a controversial point. For scholars such as Rossi, Guerin, and Sarti, Mussolini had an organic support from the big magnates. Rossi, Guerin, and Sarti explicitly link Mussolini's rise to power with the attempt of the big landowners and magnates to check union demands in the farmlands and in the factories. Other scholars, such as Melograni, denies the existence of any organic support to Mussolini from the big magnates, because among them there was a plurality of attitudes towards fascism. Nevertheless, we know that thanks to archival research, that Mussolini had the financial support of some of the big names in the electrical, the tire, and the steel and iron industries in the form of financing of his newspaper and of the election campaign of the PNF in 1922. In 1914, Mussolini founded his first newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, And according to De Felice, this newspaper was financed by capital from a group of Italian industrialists interested in Italy's entry into the war. They were Ferdinando Maria Perrone, he headed Ansaldo, an iron and steel industry, Carlo Esterle of Edison, an electrical company, Giovanni Agnelli of Fiat, Emilio Bruzzoni of Unione Zuccheri, a sugar industry, and Vittorio Emanuele Parodi, who headed shipping company. In recent years, archival research proved that Comit, a bank, provided support to Mussolini's newspapers. We have developed this line of research concerning the company which founded Mussolini's newspapers by means of a survey of the pages of Popolo d'Italia in searches of the companies who bought advertising spaces in the years from 1914 to 1924. This is the first time that this kind of survey is conducted for the entire decade from 1914 to 1924. So, in this respect, our paper improves the knowledge concerning the origin of the flow of the capital that financed Mussolini's political project in its initial stages. So, thanks to our survey, we can head Società Italiana per le Lampade Elettriche Z, a company of the Edison Group, Pirelli, Officine Meccaniche Miani Silvestri, a mechanics industry, and Chimica Migone, a chemical industry. Our paper addresses the following question: how much was it worth to have close early connections with the PNF? Following the tracks of Ferguson and Vogt, who studied the reaction of German stock market to Hitler's rise to power, we perform an event analysis in order to assess the value of political connections of firms with the PNF. Our event window covered the March on Rome. It is a 21-day event window. We have 10 prevent days. The event day is October the 28th, 1922, and we have 10 post-event days. In order to identify the connected firms with the PNF, we perform a network analysis. As for the Italian stock market during the years of Mussolini's rise to power, in those years, the Italian stock market was less advanced than, for example, the German one. There were seven stock exchanges in Milan, Rome, Turin, Genoa, Trieste, Naples, and Florence. There was a sort of topographic division among the different markets that reflected the industrial specialization of each region. For example, Milan was the leading Italian stock market for state bonds, banking bonds, and many other securities. Turin was the leading stock market for electric stocks, and Genoa was the leading stock market for sugar stocks. In 1920, only 120 societies were quoted in Milan, which was the leading market for exchange value. And more importantly, stock market transactions were often somewhat opaque because of structural conflict of interest due to the connection between listed companies and mixed banks. At the beginning of the last century, the Italian bank system was a peculiar mix of traits from the Anglo-Saxon model and the German model of a universal bank. In other words, a few big banks and a group of firms that was financed by them tended to form something like a credit industry organization that mutually influenced the conduct of business and credit management. As for our dataset, we use Il Sole, organo ufficiale della Camera di Commercio e Industria di Milano, a financial newspaper for daily stock prices from the Milan Stock Exchange, and we use a standard Italian database, IMITA, for firm characteristics such as industry classification, synthetic balance sheet, and boards. Both data sources are being merged into a unified relational database, and this is the first time that such combination is realized. This graph represents the corporate network of the Milan Stock Exchange in terms of interlocking directories. Our benchmark here is 1921, and we have identified 10 clusters. One of these, cluster 1, is the cluster of connected firms. Orange nodes represent firms belonging to the connected firms, and node size reflects degree. In this table, we have the details of the firms belonging to the cluster of connected firms. For instance, we have Società Ligure Lombarda per la raffinazione degli zuccheri, which was headed by Bruzzone. As we know, Bruzzone was in the group of the first industrialists which financed Mussolini's newspaper. Eridiana, Società Industriale, in the first months of 1923 started to finance the second Mussolini newspaper, Il Corriere d'Italia. And Distillerie Italiane is a company of Società of Veridiana Group, because alcohol was a byproduct of sugar refining. And we have as well L'Ansaldo. We know that Ansaldo was in the group which financed Mussolini's newspaper. So in this case, we have combination of historical research with econometric analysis. This figure represents the reaction of Milan Stock Exchange market to Mussolini's rise to power. The 0 point is our event day, that is the March on Rome, and our estimation windows consist of 3 months before the event day and the event window, and during the event day, that is 0 point, the abnormal returns of the connected firms amounted to 2%. This figure presents the same situation, but in terms of abnormal, accumulated abnormal returns. In this case, during the event day, the accumulated abnormal returns amounted to 2.8%. This table represents our estimation of the value of political connection with the PNF. The coefficient CL1 represents the value of belonging to the connected cluster, and before the event day, that is from July 1922 to October 27, this coefficient is not significant. After the event day and during our event windows, the coefficient is significant at it amounts to 0.7%. Our evaluation is has a weekly basis, so if you compound this coefficient on a monthly basis, we have excess returns amounted to 2.8%. So, as for the quantitative side of our research, we can conclude that during our event day, that is the March on Rome, connected firms had abnormal returns for 2%, and after the event day, connected firms had an excess returns amounting to 2.8%. As for a theoretical conclusion, we can say that our research calls into question studies in firm dynamics that exclude the role of power and politics in the capitalist competition process, because of the possibility for the firms in the connected cluster to outperform the rest of the economy in terms of stock market returns. Thank you.
All right, our other paper is by Gerard Dumenil. So please, Gerard, just take it from here. You have to turn on your thing. That turns me off automatically, which is a great merit.
And can we go to my PowerPoint, please? Okay, so the paper I will present is related to the work by Thomas Piketty, but not only Thomas Piketty, but also Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman, Gabriel Zuckman. Yes, the title is here. And I'm working with another economist whose name is Dominique Levy. And actually, we wrote 4 or 5 papers around Piketty's work, not only after the publication of the book, but even before, because we think that the data on income and wealth are extremely important to understand the dynamics of capitalism. It doesn't mean that we agree with the interpretation which are given by Piketty in particular in his book, and because actually we disagree, as you can see. But this is not what I'm going to present today. We have other papers with all the mathematics, the models, and the concrete aspect of history. Today, what I want to do is different, which is to, let's forget, about Piketty's, Saez, and Zuckman interpretation. And we already used the data in the past, as I said, and let's see how we interpret this set of data on income and wealth. So in the paper, you have the references to the other paper where we discuss the work and the interpretation. Here, I'm going to present our own interpretation, one aspect of our own interpretation. So this is really about the history of income and wealth. So it fits rather well in the topic of the session. And the period I will consider is a period which goes from about World War I to the present, or slightly after World War I to 2011. Okay? So I will use a lot of charts because we love charts, as you know. And I'm going to work in 2 time frames. First, I will present a graph covering the entire period from World War I to 2011 without significant breaks. And I will show you how, if I get the machine here, thank you, how we, should I turn that? Here, okay. So how we interpret, so it's not I will not follow the order because the time is very limited. So I start with this graph here. So people who are familiar with Piketty's and Zuckman and size data we'll understand rapidly. So the variables here concern two income fractals. You know that in Piketty's data, you have the larger broad group, for example, for income or total income or wages, 0 to 90, which is the lower fractile. And then you have the top 10% in terms of income, and the top 10% is divided into 7 distinct groups. Okay? In Piketty's data, we know nothing about the group between 0 and 10, for example, in the entire income hierarchy. You have 0, 90, and then you go to the top 10%, and then you can divide again. So here, what we consider is two fractals. The fractals that I will present never overlap, okay? In the sense that, for example, in this graph, you can see the top fractals, two top fractals. First, the well-known 99 to 10% of income, and second fractile is 90 to 99. So we take the top 10%, we divide in two groups, the top 1% and the rest, which is between 90 and 99. And what we want to investigate here is not the level of income or wealth, but it is the composition of income of incomes. Okay? So in total income, we divide two categories of income, which are on the one hand wages, and on the other hand capital income. There are also a third category which fluctuates, but not so much. I leave that aside because we don't have time to enter into the details. And I will consider here wages compared to capital income. Capital income, wages in the broad sense, including all supplements. Capital income means, of course, dividends, interest, and other things. And so the composition of income. And if you look at the first group, the continuous line at the top of the graph of the chart here, you can see that the group which is a 90 to 99% fractile in the hierarchy of income they are wage earners. Okay, in the sense that beginning after World War II, in particular, more than 90% of their incomes are wages. Okay. These people are people with nice wages, okay? I will call that broadly managers. They can be in the state, they can be the government, they can be the private sector, mostly in the private sectors. They have rather high wages. They are wage earners. You can see at the beginning there is a change, okay, around the Great Depression, which modified many things, actually. But then, you have this line, there is a slight upward trend. And so those people now, maybe they have 5-6% of their income, which is capital income, in the sense that they have some dividends, they receive some dividend, but basically they are wage earners. And the second group below is interesting. It is the top 1%. And there you can see a very important historical transformation. And if you begin during the 1920s, for example, you see that this group, his income was made of 40% wages, which means 60% capital income. So the top 1%, the famous top 1%, you are in the US, 60% in the 1920s of its income was capital income. They were capitalist family in a sense. If you make 60% of the income from interest, dividend, and so on. Now, if you move with time, as time passes, it's quite fascinating because it's a very steady trend. You see gradually in the income of the top 1%, wages and wages and wages, and you reach the point now above 80%, which means that still, this group, they are making some money in the form of capital income, but basically they are wage earners also. This is a very important transformation that we interpret in terms of relations of production divided between ownership and control. We are now in societies. We are in the US, not in France. Huh? We are not in France. We are in the United States. We are maybe in the United Kingdom, here precisely in the United States, but we are not in France. We are not in Germany. It's a completely different story. Very important. Huh? But these people now, the 1%, you know, the famous 1%, they are wage earners. They have 18, 20, maybe % of capital income, but they are wage earners. This is a very important rise of the power of what I would call control, you know, management, organization, you know, to receive very important share of income. Now, this is really the long-term transformation in 1 century, more than 1 century transformation. But now I will divide, you know, the period. And I will show you on my graph number 1. So I move backward, if I can. My graph number 1 here. Here we are considering, I recall in Piketty's data, the hierarchy of income 0, 90. Then we have the top 10%. The top 10% we can divide in 7 groups with absolutely no overlap. The graph here represents the purchasing power in constant dollars, of course, of each of these groups historically. But as you can see, we normalize all the data to about the 1960s and 1970s. During this period of time, the various purchasing power of all these fractals evolved at about the same speed. Doesn't mean that they were equal, of course, because top people, you know, were making more money, but they were moving at the same speed. But what is important to see in this graph, so we normalized everybody, okay, to the value for the 1960s and early 1970s here. But what you can see, if you can see the details of the graph here, and you have the fractile on the bottom, but it's very easy to understand, and it's completely fascinating to me. Because you see that in the early period, there is a type of phenomenon of convergence. Convergence, you know, to the level of the 1960, to the movement of the 1960, 1960. For example, if you look at the top group, which is 1 out of 10,000, 1 out of 10,000 people with the highest income, you can see that their purchasing power was actually diminishing in constant dollars to the 1960s. Then they begin to rise like the other income, okay? If you look at the bottom group here, the dark spots here, which is a 0, 90%, you can see they are fluctuating at a rather low level. You can see the log scale on the graph here. And then, with World War II, they begin to rise rapidly, much more rapidly, of course, than the top group, because the top group are even diminishing. Their purchasing power is rising. The rise of all purchasing power converge in the central period. And then the big event that we call neoliberalism, capitalism, we enter into a new society. And this begins in the second half of the 1970s and then 1980s. And you have exactly the symmetrical phenomenon. If you compare with the early period, you see the purchasing power of the top income, which is rising tremendously to the top here. And in the paper, you will see the figure in the table, while the purchasing power of the 0.90 stagnating completely. But what is interesting, that really, you see there is absolutely no disorder. Absolutely no disorder. You can see each group. You rise from one fractile to the other fractile, and it's increasing more, We are entering into a new world. How do we enter a world of inequality? I'm speaking of income inequality. So what is this world? This is a neoliberal world, okay? But neoliberal world, now I will show on my graph 4, but it's going to be about the same story. So I will show you exactly the same figure for wages. This is the average wage for each household in the same fractile with the same methodology. And you can see, before we were considering total income, now we are considering wages, only wages. You see exactly the same story. Stagnation of the purchasing power even a slightly diminishing, of the top fractile, 1 out of 10,000, and then the sharp rise of the other group after the Great Depression or after World War II, convergence to the 1960 and 70, and then incredible divergence. It's not at all only a problem of capital income. It is basically a problem of wages if you look at the data. So this relates to my first figure that I have shown, what we see historically, very continuous evolution. I am at the top, 1%, more and more and more and more or more wages. Doesn't mean that the owners of corporation, the big capitalist family, are poor. Doesn't mean that at all. But in the 1%, constantly more wages, more wages, more wages. Here you can see only for wages exactly the same story. How do we interpret that? We interpret that politically, okay? In terms of classes, social classes. You have a first period which begins with the Great Depression. I cannot enter into the details that we publish in many books and articles. And in the first period, it's a period of convergence, diminishing inequality. Rising power of what I call the class of managers, diminishing power and diminishing income, at least relatively to other groups, to the 1960s. 1960s, 70s, still we have inequalities, but everybody more or less is moving forward at the same speed. Then neoliberal capitalism, this is what we call a new social order, new politics, new policy, globalization, transformation of management of corporation, new economic policy, everything to the advantage of the fraction of the population which are at the top of the income hierarchy. And so this is the type of political interpretation we gave. And I will finish with the last graph that I will show you. This graph is you see, our interpretation is that after World War II and after the Great Depression, after World War II, up to the 1960s, 70s, you have some type of social alliance between managers of the public and private sectors and what we call popular classes. And so the economy is transformed, society is transformed, in particular in Europe, but here we are dealing with the United States, but also, as you can see, in the United States. Then the neoliberal revolution. Neoliberal revolution means the previous alliance between classes of manager, organizers, and popular classes is broken, and develop a new alliance to the right, and this new alliance will allow capitalist classes, which are still existing, of course, to restore their previous domination. But they don't do that alone. They also do that with managers. And the income and wealth of managers increase also tremendously. Now I will finish with this graph just to show you what happened at the top. The top here we are in the 1 out of 10,000 households. Okay, and we are considering here this 1 out of 10,000 of households, what is the fraction of total income they make, okay? And you can see exactly what I explained before, but seen from the viewpoint of the top here, which is that prior to World War II, they were making this is a continuous line, more or less 3% of total income. But what was the composition of this income? Look at the second curve to the left here, you can see 1930, mostly, this is the second line, capital income. So, very simple, 1 out of 10,000 families, those people are making now $1 million every month, okay? What is their income? Okay, their income is basically capital income. The traditional capitalist configuration, very simple. Now you see the big political change, Great Depression, World War II, the socialist worker movement, and so on, and their share of income diminishes tremendously, by diminishing tremendously with the war, but still diminishing up to 1970. These people are now concentrating a much, much lower fraction of total income. They are still capitalists. You can see the dotted line here. And then we enter the neoliberal revolution. Neoliberal miracle. Okay, miracle, the new concentration of income in favor of these groups. And now you have the three components. The three components are 1/3 of this restoration, 1/3 wages, 1/3 is capital income. They are still capitalist family, but 1/3 wages, okay? Because those people are there, you know, in the boards of directors, and they also make wages, these families. And the third one is entrepreneurial income. But other studies show that this entrepreneurial income, it's not that they are small owners of corporation, you know. It means that they have what do you call that, S corporation, okay, which is a problem of taxation and so on. So now we have this group, new concentration of income. And our interpretation is the following. It's all a political story, you know. There was the continuous movement forward of new managerial classes. Nothing is going to stop that. In the first decades that I have described, alliance with popular classes, inequalities are diminishing tremendously. The purchasing power of popular classes is increasing tremendously. Then, you know, 1960s, 70s, this is a transition period. We enter into neoliberalism, explosion of inequality in favor of some. Two groups are benefiting from that. Managerials with very high wages, they continue their way, okay? But also now capitalist classes are back, okay? And they recover their high concentration of income in their favor. Although you can see that even in the top, 1/3 of his income is now called wages, okay? Of course, in the broad sense. And so it's really a completely new configuration now in this neoliberal world, okay? So I will stop here, and I'm sorry I don't have time to tell you more about the politics of all that, about the historical details, and I focus on the data, because this was a paper based on the work of Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that after the publication of Piketty books, there was a very important paper published by Saez and Zuckman. And this paper is called Wealth Inequality in the United States since 1913, Evidence from Capitalist Income Data. And actually, you know, they revise completely, I can say, Piketty's data on wealth that I have not shown, okay? And if you are really interested in this problem of wealth and income inequality, I think you should take a look at this paper, because the results are significantly different. But, you know, as a whole, it's everywhere the same story. The story, I tried to give you our own interpretation.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Look, I am also the commentator on these papers. And the first thing I feel obliged to say is I think they're both really excellent papers. I've already said that. Let me talk a bit about the paper from the trio from Italy, and then I'll talk about Gerard's. Now, in all of these cases, I'm not claiming to be able to say a whole lot with great finality. They raise a lot of questions. Now, in the case of the paper by Tiziana and Ariel and Nadia, first of all, I like the basic analysis a lot. When they started, I had a string of Italian economic historians tell me it was impossible to do the type of analysis they just did, and they predicted complete disaster. It is admittedly, and here, I think you probably, when you write this up finally, you want to say this. I know you know this because I've talked to you. You've got the case of a developing market at this point. Developing market price movements don't usually look like developed country stock markets. You see bigger movements, even event analyses of those that people do try to take account of that fact. The price stuff often doesn't move for a while. Then when it finally moves, it moves really a lot. And things like that. Moreover, their particular case does indeed have banking industry relations that complicate all kinds of things there. And so I'm really happy to see that you get results here. I would make a few comments, which is you got to put this in perspective on Mussolini, because there's several elements in the political coalition here, right? And there's landowners are mostly not you can't buy or sell anything on the Milan Stock Exchange that'll really give you a good index to landowner prospects. I mean, you could imagine, you know, some fruit company or something like that, but this is not now, it's back then. So you're not going to be able to say much about that. Then there is the problem of the king. Now, the king problem in institutional terms is worth a much longer look, because behind the king, for sure, sit a block of financiers. And the problem for all of them, in many cases, is they'd like to have these folks had just paid for a good chunk of the war, bought a lot of bonds. They wanted those bonds paid back in real money. One of the perduring problems in Italian economic history, if you follow it, is the question about the sort of extraordinary attention paid to the high value of the lira by Mussolini and trying to make sure it stays there, even when sometimes it seems economically irrational. And this bites back on some of the cases. I mean, I'm struck, for instance, in your treatment of fiat, which is definitely helping the future Duce during the war. Doesn't seem to show a movement in 1922 there. But you know, if fiat is also, if the owner of fiat happens to be one of the richest of Italians, he may have an interest in bonds that's rather different from the firm. There was, in particular, in the case of fiat, it's a case I happen to know moderately well, they were certainly pushing generally high value for the lira. I mean, you guys get a chance to comment back, so please do at that. Now, just in general, there's a sort of another thing here. I don't want to dump on this because I know how much work it was. I know because I have done it. I've typed in stock price stuff myself along with Joachim Vogt. But you did the Milan Stock Exchange. And one wants to say, in this one, given especially the results for electricity in some of these cases, you know, probably the Torino Stock Exchange needs a look. I mean, that's a bit of a something I think the obvious follow-up. This is not to dump on your results. It's to just say this one probably needs doing. I don't think it's necessary to do the whole country's stock exchanges, and you also get into some complex problems like what if they're multi-quotes on the same exchange? We've often talked about this. My basic take on this is that Italian economic historians have spent an enormous amount of time ignoring this obvious problem. And it's about time that somebody did it. And I'm delighted to see that they've done it. And I'm looking forward to reading your final product. Now, let me just say a few words about Gerard's paper, which, you know, I obviously find this very congenial to a large extent, and I would note, I can't help when I see, from an interrupted time series standpoint, I mean, the obvious 1980 coincide, the turn there and a lot of stuff coincides obviously with Ronald Reagan, and, you know, it's the type of question as one reads. In the case of Mussolini, you can be sure there's a real political change. In 1980, we might want to look harder at that, but the sub-theme here is clearly the relation of economics to politics, and I understand what you just said at the end of your paper, that if you had time, you'd have talked more about the politics of it. You didn't have time. I would pose this question to you, though, and it's a question. I mean, not only am I not sure of the answer, I've talked to enough of the folks in the income distribution debate to know most of them don't know the answer, which is just pose it sort of in a almost barefoot empirical way. if you're just trying to say, okay, what is really driving this massive process of the creation of inequality? What does it? Is it that folks after 1980 really learned how to reduce wages a lot by, maybe they just tried harder. You know, you give stock to a bunch of managers and they would like to reduce everybody to the level of a McDonald's if they could. It's just that they can't. Is it that in some cases you get monopoly gains from technological innovation? That does seem to me, you got to say it though, I mean, you look a little harder on that. I mean, Bill Gates' father was a lawyer, and my reading of the Microsoft history, besides depending on the Justice Department telling IBM don't wipe them out, that they spend a lot of time in court rather more than in laboratories inventing new useful products. I mean, that's a sort of, but that's a detail. The point is that they're probably, for sure, I mean, I don't share the view that sort of Thomas Friedman approach, which is, it's been a wonderful 30 years. Just think of your cell phone. You know, for most people it has not been, and indeed growth in the, you know, in the post-war period was much faster before 1973 than after. But I mean, that's part of this, maybe a story. Then there is the discussion, there's a bunch of Americans, particularly folks who take the MIT version of the production function, that think it's really real estate. And because they can't find something moving so fast in the production function. And my strong sense is the real estate discussion's kind of a red herring, in that what you're actually seeing is people getting rich, then they go buy land, and that, you know, as you get more billionaires competing to own a chunk of Manhattan, say, is a process that the New York Times has extensively documented, indeed worldwide billionaires competing to own a chunk of Manhattan, but that's not how these people are getting rich. It's a mistake to sort of see that as the essence. I mean, my sense of this, and I'm not claiming that I can settle this at the moment, and is if I were trying to do this and sort of think of it in process and institutional terms, the heart of the matter, your story is compatible with this, but it might lead, I don't know, we might just see the difference, the data a different way. The heart of this business is the move into leverage buyouts, which a process that then generalizes. I mean in the following way. What happens is you get a company that looks like it's not doing so well, or maybe was doing well and you want to wreck it. Never mind. I'm going to set that whole controversy to a side. You then buy it and take it private, and you take a chunk of the management with it. Now, in that sense, what you're doing is, for sure, some capitalist is making an alliance with some managers. They are also vastly reducing the number of the managers, typically, there. They're going to pay them a lot more. I mean, but this process can be seen in a lot of American companies if you start to look at it in detail. And then you often take the company back out and you sell it. And at that point, the stock market has got a roll. Now, I am a little... I get nervous at the very top. I've had this fear for many years because I've tried to deal with this problem. It comes up especially in your evaluation of financial salaries because there's this endlessly complex problem about what's value added in finance. And I don't mean just the Paul Volcker sneer that there never was except for the ATM. I mean, when you try to actually figure out what value added is, it's a famous problem there. And one wants to say sometimes when you look at bank salaries, I faced this in some empirical work on the Great Depression, these folks are not quite handing out capital income to themselves. They're somehow taking wages, stuff that would be wages and anything else, and it's just getting paid out in shares or something like that. But that happens a lot, I think, at the top of the income. That type of, I know there's a fairly straightforward definition of wages. You know, they send you a W-2 form or something like that to do it. But at the very top, particularly when you get a sort of leverage buyout, I mean, frankly, my impression of this, having studied a fair amount, is first the guys bought the company. then they were always planning on bringing it back out to make a lot of capital gains, but then they just said to themselves, why don't we just take the whole thing? Let's take the money and pay ourselves too. And, you know, is that just because it's, I mean, this is now money being handed to people who are really capitalists, who wouldn't, I mean, these are wages in IRS terms. I'm less clear about what the proper functional thinking about this is at the very top, and I get very nervous as I look at these what are admittedly very high levels of wages. I don't deny this. Anybody can see this. It's that I have the feeling that in a lot of enterprises somehow we have moved beyond the pillars of Hercules in a clear definition of what wages are at the very top, and that the political story might change there depending on sort of how you answer that question. And with that, I'm just going to stop. I mean, you folks all have a chance to reply to me. And then I think we should just throw it open to the floor. We'll do it. We'll throw it open to the floor in a little bit. First, they get a chance to comment on me. Okay. Well.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom, for your comments. Precisely on the case of Fiat, there are two details. The first one is that, as you were mentioning, it's a company quoted on the Torino Stock Exchange. It was quoted also in Milan. There was a replication of the stock price.
Afterwards. It was quoted in Milan afterwards.
It was quoted in Milan after 1922. So after the March on Rome.
Right, just after, which may say something about
yes.
why there was a lot of interest in it.
And as regards all the historical details, I think maybe Tiziana wants to talk about the kingdom. Your point about how we proceeded, I think that the key issue is that the mixing of econometric event study analysis with network analysis. Yes. The point is, when you get to work with interlocking directorates, the people connecting them are the ones that establish the links between firms. Then you detect a cluster, and on that you apply an event study. This means that sometimes, to be consistent, you need to find the connections between the people that we found, and it is very difficult sometimes to see the importance of this, because you have individual firms that are also have an average return which is bigger than average success returns. The point is that when you cluster them, the whole cluster outperforms the market. And I think this is the key point that sometimes that I think is innovative on that respect. Okay, maybe to the historical details.
Yeah, we are working on that.
You have to push your thing.
Yeah. Okay, we are working on the king problem. Yeah, I agree with you. We need to focus on this point. In 1924, there are some there is some evidence of a connection between the king and an American oil company, but we have to go into details. So.
No, just about the issue of the network analysis of, the analysis of the network of interconnections. I think that you were mentioning the fact that Italian stock exchange was a developing one, and also another peculiarity of the Italian case, I think, is that you have relatively few individuals which basically connected almost all firms in the network. So this is probably an issue which was something which was true also before Mussolini rise to power, in the sense that Italian productive system, let's say industrial system, has always been characterized by strong connections between few individuals which have themselves strong connections with power, be it the king or Mussolini or anyone else. So this is probably something different with respect to what you found for the case of Germany, and which probably made it's a bit more difficult to identify really a group, a well-defined group of connected firms. No, ma se lui schiaccia.
hit that
Press it.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments. Many aspects here, so I will try to select a little bit. First, no, we don't believe that this is really linked to technology. Sometimes people interpret globalization. Globalization is a consequence of technology. No, if I had time, I would explain that, in my opinion, it was possible to have another economic world using the new technology, which would help a lot, but in a different manner. Now, the question of real estate, on which has been raised, no, because when I spoke of capital income, I mentioned dividends and interest, but I should have also mentioned rents. Okay, so we have this data, so we look at that. It's not really the rise of rents which made those people richer. And I mentioned the difference with France. For example, in France, you have a tremendous rise of the value of buildings, of construction, offices, and houses. But in France, there is nothing similar to the rise of inequality, in Piketty data, which means considering the 0-90 globally. There is nothing similar in terms of rise of inequality, although, the price of flats in Paris rose tremendously, but it did not produce the same outcome in the same manner. So, of course, there is a problem with real estate, because in Piketty books, a lot very complex analysis, because you never know if you are really in the US, if you are in France, where inequality rise, they don't increase, what is the value of capital in houses, and what is the value of capital in firms, and so on. So there is a huge complexity, and it's very difficult to really decipher all that and understand this mechanism. But we studied that rather carefully. No, it's not really it's not really real estate. It's part of the story, but it's not a large part of the story. Now, what you mentioned about, of course, the nature of incomes, wages at the top. What are these wages? Okay, and of course, big families. Well, it's very well known in the literature in the US, about power elites and so on. Of course, there you find families, they have very large portfolio of stock shares, and so on. But also the son here is the CIO of this corporation, okay? And the daughter is there in the government, and so on. So, of course, these are very powerful families, and in a sense, they are everywhere. They are everywhere where the power is, okay? So how could we divide the strictly capitalist, strictly managerial aspect of the story? It's extremely difficult to do. And there is something which corresponds to what I understood in what you said clearly, those big families at certain point in time when the circumstances are favorable, yes, they directly grab the money, from the corporation under the form of wages. They don't have to share with pension funds or I don't know what. They directly grab the money. For example, in the graph, which is still there, you can see, the peak in wages, in wages just before 2000. And we studied that carefully. And this was one of the important determinants of the crisis of 2000, not the only determinant, because they paid to themselves huge wages, so-called, okay, to the point of depressing the profit of corporation after the payment of these wages. So how can we make the difference? And to us, our interpretation is that actually you have to relate the two aspects of our story, what I've shown at the beginning. You see, you take the one person, you see rise of wages, rise of wages. Now you go to the top, which can be 1 out of 10,000 of 1 out of 1,000. In the 1 out of 1,000 families, wages represent half of the total income. Okay, 1/3 for the 1 out of 10,000. Of course, you have a confusion of incomes, but you have a confusion of income which is not, which is historically determined. In the sense that if you take the big financial institution, in our latest book in French, we study that rather carefully, you see all these big wages in the financial sector, in the big financial institution. Of course, they are there as owners, and they sit in boards, okay? And they decide to pay to themselves or say, of course, there is a confusion of income. But if you compare historically, for example, in the French, what is called in French, the Ancien Régime, okay, which means the coincidence, the end of some kind of feudal society and the rise of capitalist relations of production. If you study that through historians, you see very clearly the confusions of income at the top because of the convergence of the two types of historical determinants. So what do you see? It's very well known. You see lords, okay, people from the ancient system. They are now managing their land in a capitalist manner. They have mining. They do trade in the rest of the world. They finance trade and so on because they want to increase their income, which was diminishing, during the period of the what we call Ancien Régime. Okay, but you know, simultaneously, you see new capitalist family. What do? They buy lands, okay, and they put DE before their name, okay, and then they marry their daughter to a lord which is need really money and so on. So in this type of historical transition or confusion, of course, at the top you have a confusion of income. So I completely agree on the fact we say wages. Well, what kind of wages? What does it mean? It is a problem of relations of production. And when you have this type of confusion, which is historically created, of course, you have a mixture. And the last thing I want to add is that if you look at for example, the hierarchy of wages, I insisted on the fact, you know, you begin with 0-90%, purchasing power flat. You move a little bit up, a little bit more, a steeper slope, more a steeper slope. So there is a continuity. So we completely agree on the confusion at the top, but we see, we interpret that as some kind of historical transformation. Is just, you know, something which happened in this manner.
Could I get you to take a flat position on one other thing which I raised, which everybody always runs from, which is, okay, what's the role in all of this of just trying to flatten the wages of the rest of the population? I mean, is that the big innovation in this era, or is it something else?
Well, have been very efficient, incredibly efficient in this sense. In France, for political reasons, it was completely impossible. If you look at Piketty size data very carefully, what is the main factor in the US and in the United Kingdom? Divergence of purchasing power. In France, in Germany, in Italy, I think, of course you have big inequalities too. You have people at the top, but nothing which can compare to that. So why was the US so performing in this respect? Why France was terrible? From the viewpoint, you know, of upper classes, France was terrible. We are here in institutional historical reason. The relationship in France, you know, when neoliberalism developed, our managers, the top managers, they graduate from public schools. Okay, they pass qualifying exam. All the big system of big school in France is completely linked to the French government. And French managers, they had a huge difficulty to accept the idea that they were there to maximize stock market indices. It took years and years and years, okay, because they were prepared to something completely different. In the US, you have something similar during this period because the data that I have shown are US data. But in France, you know, they are just beginning now. And if you look the latest, you know, data from Piketty, you will see in France, maybe we begin to move in the same direction. So I'm very sorry to say, but we are probably following the US path, okay, which is not the type of path that I would like to see developing, but we begin the same direction. So these are really political, institutional factors, which are historical factors. And if you consider the 1960s, 1970s, there are many common points between France and the US. The management of corporation. But the transformation of the management of corporation in France was never the transformation of management of corporation in the US. In the US, you see distribution of dividend. You see repurchase of stocks. In our book, The Crisis of Neoliberalism, or the new book in French, we analyze that in detail. Incredible repurchase of stock. In US capitalism now, it is not the stock market which is financing the economy. It is not the stock market which is financing the economy. It's the reverse. It is the economy which is financing the stock market. Okay? So why are you so good for upper classes? I don't know. Maybe you have the answer. But in France, we are not, our upper classes are not so performing. We are just learning slowly.
Look, I'll let that point go because there's not much evidence, in fact, that the population likes its upper classes that much when you actually look hard. This is a question now of, we can take some questions. It seems to me rational to take 2 or 3 questions and then let the panel respond, and then we can go on. We have some time. We're not running out of time. Bill?
Okay. Well, I have to point out something about these data, because I refer you to an article that I wrote actually in a French journal in English, Entreprise et Histoire, about 6 years ago, called The Explosion of Executive Pay and the Erosion of American Prosperity. Now, in these data, you have a lot of capital gains in there that are top management income up to 1976 that are not counted as wages. And after 1981 in particular, you have most, and increasingly, of those wages are actually stock-based pay. And for example, you see that peak in 2000 you pointed to. That is because of the peak in the stock market. Now what happened is the reason it's reported differently is because from 1950, in the Revenue Act of 1950, they gave executives the right to have stock options taxed at the capital gains tax rate. It was very important because they had to hold on to the stock for some period of time in order to get that. But it would be reported to the tax authority, the IRS, as capital gains. That was eliminated by Congress gradually to 1976. There was actually a bipartisan backlash against that. It was led by Albert Gore, Al Gore's father, in the 1960s. 1981, there was a resurgence of stock options, but it was from a totally different source. It was the rise of Silicon Valley, attracting people away from old economy companies to new economy companies through stock-based pay. The old economy companies then went with the flow, and largely because of a whole bunch of things that had to do with the transformation of Wall Street from trading, investing to trading, the rise of shareholder value ideology, you started getting a lot of stock-based pay. All that stock-based pay, virtually all of it, is not taxed at the capital gains tax rate. There's a reason for this that I could go into, but it's not. It shows up just as wages. So when you get to, let's say, the most recent period, and the data get better after 2006, the pay, I use usually the top 500, highest paid, it's 66 to 84% is stock-based pay. Now that relates to the last point you made, which I've written on a lot, is what is happening is it's given them a incentive to allocate resources differently. And we have to remember that economics is all about the allocation of resources. And if you're looking at the US economy, whether it's in the 1920s or now, it's large corporations that are dominating that process. And what has changed is the incentives of managers within the large corporations and how they allocate resources. And that is very much related to the way they're paid. So in the 1980s, just to Tom's point about leveraged buyouts, people talked about hostile takeovers. They don't talk about it anymore. Nobody's hostile anymore. They're all in bed together, although I can tell you that the hedge funds are doing a lot better even than these managers, and they're envious of them.
Let's stick with the plan of taking a couple of questions and letting folks respond. Now, who else had hands up? Okay.
My question was for Gerard, and it has to do. My question is for Gerard, and it has to do with his differing interpretation and database from Thomas Piketty. As I read Piketty, he talks a lot about exploding executive compensation and flawed corporate law, and I teach corporate law, so that resonated with me. There's been huge changes along the time period of 1980 going forward in corporate governance law, And so I think a lot of your point about this being wage-driven is already impounded in Piketty's analysis, and he explains it well by showing a breakdown in corporate governance law, which actually tracks real changes in the American legal system that made it easier for executives to set their own compensation. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Why don't we let Gerard answer both of those, which are related, then we'll take more questions.
One, I say that I'm just commenting, on a few data to show an historical interpretation. I'm just speaking seriously, okay? So I never enter into the details of the mechanisms or into economics or politics, okay? We wrote books, one book by Harvard University Press, which is entitled The Crisis of Neoliberalism, in which we analyze in detail those mechanisms, okay? So I completely agree about what you said, about the relationship between top wages and the stock market. This is really the core of the analysis of neoliberalism, and the relationship, the type of alliance at the top, and the relationship and what I said, about the ambiguous nature of income at the top. So we completely agree with that, and we insist on that. In the data here, there is no capital gain, and by the way, okay, there is no capital gain. But, it doesn't change much the story. So we decided not to put that, because the problem is that capital gains in this type of theory generate huge fluctuations because of the stock market, which is moving up and down. So if you put capital gains, you see nothing. And actually, it doesn't change fundamentally the story. But of course, capital gain was absolutely crucial in the period between 1980 and 2000. You have this huge rise of the stock market. You have all these high income which are based on the stock market. So we completely agree with that. Now, what you mentioned about Piketty's book here, well, in Piketty's book, you have several stories, as I said, okay? So in a sense, the rise of neoliberalism is seen by Piketty, who comments on the rise of neoliberalism, although he never used the phrase, the word neoliberalism, okay, never. He speaks of the conservative revolution, okay, but he never speaks really of neoliberalism. He has, the political analysis is almost there, sometimes with inverted interpretation. We disagree with the exact interpretation. But Piketty has a feeling of that, because in France, everybody is speaking of that, actually. So it would be completely impossible to ignore that. When I spoke of disagreement with Piketty, is first, a slight disagreement. When he speaks of the conservative revolution, he doesn't go at all to the end of the story. He doesn't analyze the transformation of the management of corporation. He doesn't analyze the new functioning of the stock market and everything. But it's impossible to analyze everything. The main disagreement is not there, okay? The main disagreement is on Piketty's basic laws, historical laws. You have two laws. One is an identity. But the fundamental law of Piketty is beta, which is the ratio of the stock of capital over GDP, is equal to, to the ratio of saving rate and so on. This is, when I say that we are criticizing Piketty, we are criticizing Piketty on this aspect of his analysis, which is the core of his analysis, okay? The way he interprets the size of capital compared to GDP, and the consequences for distribution. And in various papers, some papers are empirical, others theoretical, and even one is very mathematical, because I'm working with a mathematician, and we just say it is wrong. Okay? It is theoretically and empirically wrong. It's very easy. You take the equations, okay? You take the data and you measure. Beta, the second big law of capitalism, which is the center of Piketty analysis, very simple. You take the data in the United States for the period in which the data is very good, okay, or better than in other period, and you calculate. The outcome is completely off, okay? Nothing to do with what he wants to explain. So when I say that we criticize Piketty, I'm not saying that the data is not interesting. I'm not saying that the entire story is uninteresting, but I'm saying that the core analysis is completely off, you know, theoretically and empirically. Does Piketty see neoliberalism? A little bit, a little bit. Sometimes with huge confusions, okay, but he has a sense of that. As I said, in France, everybody in the left, you know, knows that, and Piketty is from the left, okay? And but this, I decided not to present a paper to criticize Piketty. I decided to have a different view, which is, I like this data, even if there are problems there. In particular, since Size and Zuckman corrected for the estimates of wealth. I love this data, because this data we use in the last 10 years, because this is our story, okay? And so I take the data and I tell my story.
What about other questions? Oh, this here.
Yeah, thanks. I'd be interested to know to what extent you think the decline in unionization rates, particularly in the States, has acted as a removal of a counterweight. The decline of le taux de syndicalisation aux États-Unis, le fait que cet homme a descendu. No, but I mean, no, sorry, trade unionization, trade union rates.
Trade union rates.
No, I mean, because the IMF is just producing this work looking at the impact of decline of unionization between the top decile and the bottom decile. But going into the 1%, the extent to which that's had a very significant influence on counterweight or any evidence you've got on it.
I don't know if it is only the rate, of course. Oh, yeah. I don't know if it is only the rate, you know, but of course, you know, the problem of unions is crucial. Is crucial. If you see, you know, what I have shown, you know, which is the purchasing power of the 0.90, completely flat in the US since the 1970s. Can you believe that? Seen from a French viewpoint, it's completely unbelievable, except that this is what they are beginning to do. And we also have the same problem with unions, okay? So maybe we are following the same track. So of course, you know, but unions are part of the story. The problem is that for some reasons, you know, historical and institutional, political, yes, gradually, you know, these groups had to accept more and more and more. But still, you know, if you only look at Piketty's data, because of 0.90, you don't have the entire story. Okay, and other studies exist, but the problem is that it's sometimes difficult to interpret. But for example, in France, I would love to see clearly the 0.10%, to see clearly the 0.20%, because I believe the situation deteriorated a lot. And of course, you know, in the 0.90 is huge. I mean, to get to 90, you need people with wages of $5,000 a month at least, okay? So they are not poor people in any sense. And this is apparent, for example, in Piketty's book, because Piketty understands very well concerning wealth that, for example, you have people of some kind of middle classes, and now the parents are helping your children to buy the apartment, okay, to buy the home. And so they begin to accumulate and they pay. So these people are not completely poor. But you know also that in the US, in terms of wealth hierarchy, between 0 and 50%, 2% of total wealth. Okay? But sure, you have also new groups developing. And so this has consequences in terms of inequality. Measuring inequality is very difficult, in particular, wealth inequality.
I think we have time for one more question. Lance?
Yeah, I was just curious, if you looked at the Congressional Budget Office data, which actually tells a somewhat different story. First of all, you get a fairly complete breakdown of income by quintile, and you can look at the bottom quintile and see what's going on there. And secondly, they give a much lower wage share in the top 1% than you're getting. And there's a contrast there. I have no explanation. There's certainly a contrast there that you should take a look at.
Yeah, that's true, you know. The paper we wrote is a paper which is based on Piketty, Size, and Zuckman data, okay?
Yeah, but there's other data.
Yeah, exactly, and we look at that too. We look at that too, okay? But, you know, it's not a paper, in this paper, there is a choice, okay? We take this data and we see it's already very complex, okay? But I agree that this is not the bottom line of the study of inequalities. And we have data, and we should study that. We tried to do that. So it's very clear, you know, when you do that, you see very interesting things, but you don't see everything. And the data on inequality are often very...
We got, I think, one last question, if it stays, yeah.
Can I make just a comment on this last point, just to clarify? When you use Piketty's data, when you use IRS data, these are fiscal data. There are many issues with fiscal data, and this is market income. Just to make very clear, that's income before redistribution through social transfers and taxation. Consequently, when people say there was no gain, first of all, there is no information on 20% of people who don't file tax returns. But when people say there is no change in incomes of the bottom 90%, it does not mean that their disposable income has not changed. It's their market income that has changed. Simply clarification, because the household survey data, CPS data, are different. Congressional Budget Office, which uses the combination of the two, gives you different numbers. So these are very useful data, but they are not the whole story.
I completely agree. You know, I didn't mention it because I tried to make my point, but something which is extremely important is that, for example, data on wages are not after taxation. They are before taxation. So, of course, you know, tax rate after World War II were very high. So actually, the way we show, you know, the diminishing inequality is just showing, you know, prior to taxation, not after. So this will make a huge difference. But the problem is that we don't have this data, at least in Piketty. Piketty is never commenting on that, of course, you know. He's always on his data. Second thing that I have did not insist on that for the same reason, which is what we have here is income tax data. So what about tax havens? And of course, it's in particular the work of Zuckman, you know. Zuckman wrote a book on this, a dissertation with Piketty, to say, well, tax haven exists, you know, but it's a problem of 5%, and I don't know exactly what. Doesn't change really the conclusion. I'm absolutely not convinced that this is true. If you move to the top 10, 1 of 10,000 or 1,000, I'm sure the rise of inequality that I have shown in this graph, this is, you know, a small part of the story, I personally believe. Piketty believes no, okay? He thinks, you know, through the work of Zuckman, they have a way of approaching that this is not really a problem. Personally, I think this is a huge problem. And I can tell you that with Dominique Levy many years ago, we thought of using tax data in the US because we were looking, because of our analysis of neoliberalism, we were looking for data on rich people, the income of rich people. And we began to look at this same tax data, and we thought, okay, if you want the 1 out of 1,000, you will never see actually how much money they make. So we abandoned because it was very difficult. And actually, Piketty made all his research on that. But also it's important to tell that the second aspect of inequality, which is wealth inequality, wealth inequality do not come from the IRS, okay? Piketty made a huge work to reconstruct from inheritance, the flow of inheritance, and to infer, you know, wealth inequality from that. And then a few months ago, or 1 year ago, I don't remember, Saez and Zuckman come and they say, no, this is bad. And so they take the income and they derive wealth from income, not from inheritance. And they have new estimates, as I mentioned at the beginning, which are very different from Piketty's estimate. So you see, income inequality is already difficult to estimate, but of course, wealth inequality, that's another story. Very, very complex.
All right, well, we're out of time. I'd like to thank the panelists, all 4 of them there, for their presentations, and the audience for its participation.